Riven Ashcroft pulled her into the bedroom the way he always did after a long meeting, wordless, certain, his hand rough against the small of her back, the scent of gunpowder and whiskey still clinging to his collar. She did not resist. 18 months of quiet devotion had built something inside her that felt in that moment unshakable. 18 months of watching him from across rooms, of catching his eyes find hers first among a crowd of 100 people, of hearing him whisper more than once in the dark, "You're the only one I trust." She did not know yet that her life was about to break in half. Rain fell over Philadelphia the way it always did in October, sideways, relentless tapping against the penthouse glass like something trying to get in. 31 floors above the Delaware River, the city's lights blurred into gold smears through the wet windows, and inside the world was quiet, except for the low hum of a whiskey glass being set down on marble. This was the world Isolde Maren had stepped into, a Mafia boss's empire dressed up in charity galas and quarterly earnings calls so that no one outside it ever had to call it what it was. His shirt was open at the throat, just enough to reveal the tattoo coiled there, a serpent wound tight around the letter A. He kissed her shoulder that night, right where her dress had slipped from her round, soft frame, and murmured against her skin, "Once things settle, I'll bring you into the family the right way." She closed her eyes, her lips curved just slightly in the dark. It was a sweet moment, a false one. By morning, the rain had softened to a gray mist over the river. Isolde lay still beneath the blankets, only half awake when the door opened. A senior member of the family stepped in without knocking, the way men who believed themselves untouchable always did. The two men stood near the foot of the bed, and then, believing she was still asleep, they slipped into Russian. They had done this in front of her 100 times, certain that the curvy American woman with the soft accent could not possibly understand a word of it. They had never once asked. Riven smirked as he said it, the exact careless smirk of a man who has never had to consider whether the person in the room might be listening. His voice was lazy. "She's just bed practice. I needed to get used to a fuller body before I touched the Volkov girl. Don't let her start thinking she matters." Isolde understood every single word. Her heart didn't race, it slowed, the way a body does when it decides quietly that survival requires stillness. She had spent years training herself in linguistics and pattern recognition, first as a translator, later doing the kind of quiet analytical work that never came with a job title. Every hour of that training served her now. 18 months of trust dissolved into ash in 4 seconds. She kept her eyes shut until the men left. The door clicked softly behind them. Only then did she open her eyes. Her fingers found the ring on her hand. Turning it slowly under the gray light, she noticed an engraving on the inside of the band, a string of numbers, a cipher she recognized instantly from a file she'd decoded 5 years earlier, one connected to an assassination attempt on Gideon Ashcroft's life. This ring did not belong to her. It belonged to Riven's father. Isolde sat up slowly, dressed, without rushing, crossed the room and pressed her lips once, gently, to the tattoo curling along Riven's throat, a goodbye disguised as tenderness. Then she turned and walked out without looking back. She did not scream or confront him, not because she lacked the courage, but because rage would have handed him exactly what he expected from a woman he'd already dismissed as disposable. What she wanted wasn't a scene. It was time and the element of being underestimated a second time, which she now understood was the only real weapon a practice ever gets to keep. Her silence in that room was not surrender. It was the first move of someone who had already decided the game wasn't over. He said it himself, she thought, stepping into the elevator. "I'm just practice." But practice for who, and who this ring truly belongs to, he doesn't know yet. The days that followed did not look like heartbreak from the outside. Isolde did not disappear. She kept showing up, wearing the same polite smile. Riven mistook her composure for indifference, never guessing that the woman he'd dismissed had spent her entire adult life being underestimated by men exactly like him. 3 days later, alone in a small apartment across the river, Isolde sat with the ring resting on the table beside a folder she had kept sealed for 5 years, the record of the night she found Gideon Ashcroft collapsed in a hotel corridor, a coded ledger clutched in his hand, his own men too slow to help him. She had saved his life. She had never asked for anything in return. He thinks I left with nothing, she thought. He doesn't know I'm the only one who was ever paying attention. 2 weeks passed, and Isolde Maren became a woman the Ashcroft family had learned to underestimate all over again. She attended every gathering, let Riven parade Nadia Volkov through ballrooms and boardrooms, let the family whisper about a coming union between the two houses. What none of them saw was the quiet architecture she had begun building beneath her calm. Each night after the last car pulled away from whatever event had swallowed her evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table, with a single lamp burning and a notepad no one else was allowed to touch. Not plans exactly, just fragments, a name, a date, a number that didn't add up. She had learned this discipline years earlier, decoding intercepted communications for people who never thanked her by name. You don't chase the whole picture at once. You collect the pieces that don't fit, and you wait for them to start fitting themselves. Working through Jet Harlan, a man on the edges of the family's world, desperate enough to put his name where hers needed to stay hidden, she began carefully acquiring shares in one of the family's front companies, a legitimate logistics business moving cargo along the eastern seaboard. She met him for the first time in a diner 2 bridges away from anywhere the Ashcrofts might recognize either of their faces. Fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, the smell of burnt coffee thick in the air. Jet's hands hadn't stopped moving the entire meeting, turning a cufflink around and around on his wrist, a small, anxious tick she filed away without comment. He'd said yes to her offer almost before she'd finished explaining it, too quickly for a man with nothing to lose, she noticed. She said nothing, not yet. Everyone in that world understood the unspoken rule of loving the son of a mafia boss. You do not embarrass the family in public, no matter what you're made to swallow in private. Isolde had learned that rule better than anyone in the room. The ring she confirmed was more than jewelry. It was a physical key to an old safe in a South Philadelphia warehouse where the family had once stored the records they never wanted found. She did not open it yet. Patience was the only luxury a woman like her could afford. Once, late at night, she'd caught Gideon watching her from across a room while she turned the ring absently on her finger, and something in his expression, not suspicion, something closer to quiet approval, had lingered a half-second longer than it should have. She hadn't understood it then. She filed that away too. The first humiliation came at a small gathering at the Ashcroft estate, the kind of evening built entirely out of chandeliers and careful smiles. Jazz drifted low from a corner trio, ice clinking in crystal glasses, the murmur of a dozen conversations layered over one another like static. Nadia Volkov turned to her, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, her eyes doing a slow, deliberate sweep from Isolde's face down to her hips and back up again, making sure the room could see her do it. "Bed practice only needs to be soft," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. "It doesn't need to stand at the negotiating table." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest cluster of guests, quick, uncomfortable, the kind that dies the second it starts because no one's sure whose side to be on. Isolde raised her wine glass slightly, an acknowledgement, not a flinch, and said nothing. Her silence was a closed door, not a wound left open. Across the room, Riven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing either, still too far from understanding what he was watching to know it mattered. A moment later, Piper Solis, her closest friend, pressed a phone into her hand in a quiet hallway away from the noise. The screen's glow, the only light between them. An old recording played tinny through the small speaker. Gideon Ashcroft's trembling voice recorded who knew when, who knew where. "Thank you for saving my life. If my son ever needs someone real, remember this number." Isolde listened to it twice before she let herself breathe. Piper didn't ask questions. She never had. That was, Isolde thought, the entire reason she'd survived this long, with any part of herself still intact. Weeks later, in a technical meeting, security had spent 2 full days failing to crack an encrypted Russian communication lines of scrambled text scrolling across a wall-mounted screen, while 3 analysts argued in increasingly sharp tones over a whiteboard covered in false starts. Isolde stood quietly in the corner, coffee in hand, and broke it in 4 minutes. Her pen moving in short, unhurried strokes, while the room slowly went silent around her. Riven watched the entire time, arms crossed, something shifting behind his eyes that he didn't have a name for yet. Not affection, not exactly, but the first crack in a certainty he'd never had to examine. He'd built his whole understanding of her around one careless sentence in a bedroom. Watching her hands move that fast, that sure, he understood for the first time that the sentence had been wrong. At nearly the same moment, Celine Ashcroft Riven's observant younger sister passed her 3 recordings, Nadia Volkov discussing a plan with her father to use the Curvy girl as bait and then remove her. Celine had never liked easy answers. She'd spent her whole life watching her brother mistake confidence for character, and she recognized almost instantly that Isolde wasn't performing composure. She simply had it. "I don't know what you're planning," Celine told her quietly, sliding the phone across a table between them. "But I know you are planning something. I'd rather be standing next to it than guessing at it later." For the first time since the rain had stopped, someone inside this family had chosen to stand beside Isolde instead of beside their assumptions about her. Riven began to change, subtly pulling her from dangerous corners of rooms, sending someone to walk behind her at night, standing a half-step closer at gatherings than he used to, and yet, in public, he still called Nadia his future, the words landing flat and rehearsed each time, like a line from a play he was growing tired of performing. The night before the negotiation that would decide 2 families' fortunes, he came to her penthouse, rain streaking the windows behind him, his coat still damp at the shoulders. He didn't sit. He stood near the door like a man not sure he'd earned the right to come further in. "Stay here," he said. "Don't do anything foolish." After he left, Isolde looked at the ring on her hand and whispered into the dark, the rain, the only other sound in the room. "You don't know that I stopped staying still a long time ago." She stood in that room, heard herself called practice, and smiled instead of walking out. And she kept smiling for 3 more weeks. Comment respect if you think her silence was the sharpest weapon in that entire mansion. Comment weak if you think a woman who deserved better should have walked out that very first night. We're reading every single one before the next part goes up. The conference room occupied the top floor of a building that looked from the outside like an unremarkable logistics headquarters. Inside, the air was thick enough to choke on, recycled, over-conditioned, the low hum of the ventilation system, the only sound beneath 24 quiet conversations. Coffee cups sat untouched at every seat. Someone's watch ticked too loudly in the silence that followed the last handshake. Riven stood at the head of a long mahogany table, about to introduce Nadia Volkov as his future in front of the family's inner circle and the Volkov delegation. His hand rested on the back of a chair, knuckles pale. He never finished the sentence. The screen on the far wall flickered to life with a soft electronic click that everyone in the room heard at once. His own recorded voice filled the space, tinny and unmistakable. "She's just bed practice. I needed to get used to a fuller body. Every head turned. Gideon's face went very still. Somewhere near the back, one of the Volkov men set down his coffee cup with a small, careful clatter, as though sudden movement might make the moment worse. Selene stepped out from the corner where she'd been standing unnoticed the entire meeting, her heels silent against the carpet, and crossed to the table to set a small silver ring down against the dark wood. The sound of metal on mahogany somehow louder than it should have been. When she read aloud the coordinates etched inside it, her voice even and unhurried. Half the room understood with dawning horror that a safe in South Philadelphia held more than cash. It held every record the family had tried to erase. In the stunned quiet, Nadia turned toward Isolde, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass, and tipped it down the front of her dress in one deliberate motion, red spreading dark and fast across pale fabric. "Bed practice doesn't need to look pretty to show up," she said, loud enough to carry, her chin lifted, like a woman certain she'd just won something. This time, Isolde didn't simply raise a glass. She looked down at the stain unhurried, then back up at Nadia and said evenly, loud enough for the table to hear, "You'll want a better exit line than that. This isn't the room where insults land soft." Somewhere down the table, one of the older Ashcroft men exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough that Nadia's composure flickered for the first time all evening. The side door opened hard enough to bump the wall. Riven walked in. He didn't look at Nadia. He crossed to her attendant, seized his collar in one sharp motion, and forced silence over the entire Volkov delegation with nothing but the look on his face. "She is not something for you to mock." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. A hidden camera, triggered by the ring, played back the moment on a second screen Nadia's insult, the contemptuous glances of several Volkov guests, undeniable now replayed in flat, damning clarity. The room shifted from stunned to disbelieving murmurs, chairs creaking as people leaned toward each other to whisper what they weren't brave enough to say out loud. Riven looked at the screen, then at Isolde, understanding for the first time that the woman he'd dismissed as practice held in her quiet hands the power to unmake a negotiation worth millions. She walked to the center of the room, her footsteps the only sound now, every eye following her. "You once told me I was the only one you trusted," she said. "So tell me now, do you trust me enough to hear the rest?" He never got to answer. Gideon Ashcroft's phone rang a sharp, sudden sound that made half the room flinch. A call from Russia. The whole room went still. The voice on the line, tinny through the speaker Gideon held out for the table to hear, revealed undisclosed financial obligations the Volkov family had never told their prospective partners about. Obligations that made the entire proposed union considerably less appealing than anyone at that table had believed an hour earlier. Across the table, one of the Volkov men closed his eyes briefly, like a man watching a bridge he'd already crossed collapse behind him. Riven's fury toward the Volkov attendant wasn't only chivalry, it was the panic of a man realizing in real time that the person he'd been trained his whole life to discard as unimportant was the only one in that room he couldn't afford to lose. And Isolde hadn't orchestrated this exposure for revenge. Revenge would have satisfied her for an evening. What she wanted was permanence, a moment so public that no one in that family could ever again pretend her worth was up for debate. The meeting adjourned without a signed agreement, chairs scraping back one by one as the delegation filed out in a silence heavier than any argument could have left behind. Riven stayed behind long after everyone left, staring at the wine stain drying on the dress of a woman he'd once called Practice. The room around him gone dim except for the light of the still glowing screen. Later that night, alone with his father, in a study lit by a single desk lamp, Gideon was blunt. "The Volkov contract on the Chester port still has 11 months on it. We can't let that alliance collapse in public yet, not until the shipping terms are renegotiated. Keep the engagement standing in front of people. But you and I both know it's already over." He paused, studying his son for a long moment before adding quieter, almost to himself, "You should have seen what was in front of you months ago." "I did." Riven said nothing. He understood exactly what he was being asked to perform, and exactly what it would cost him to keep performing it. And for the first time, he wondered exactly how long his father had known.
The 3 weeks that followed the failed negotiation moved differently than any before them. Slower in public, faster in private. Riven learned to hold Nadia's hand at exactly the angle photographers expected without letting his eyes find hers. Learned to laugh at his father's careful jokes about the coming wedding while excusing himself early from every dinner that dragged past 9. Isolde, for her part, spent those weeks finishing what she'd started in a diner 2 bridges away, meeting Jet twice more, each time watching that same nervous cufflink turn between his fingers each time, saying less than she knew. She had pieced together by then exactly why he'd said yes so fast. It wasn't greed. A man doesn't turn a cufflink like that over greed. At a gala meant to convince Philadelphia's business elite that nothing had cracked beneath the surface, chandeliers threw gold light across the ballroom floor, a string quartet working through something slow and formal, while 100 quiet conversations rose and fell beneath it. Isolde arrived in a long black gown that did nothing to hide the soft, powerful lines of her body. Riven stood several feet away, Nadia once again at his side. A performance now, though. Only he and his father knew it. His smile fixed just a fraction too carefully in place. In the middle of the ballroom, Jet Harlan crossed the floor and dropped to one knee, the room's noise dimming into a ripple of gasps and raised phones before anyone had even understood what was happening. His hand shook just slightly as he opened the small box, not the tremor of a man overwhelmed by love, though the room read it that way, but the tremor of a man who understood exactly what he was about to become in the eyes of people who could still hurt him. Isolde looked at him for one long moment, long enough that even Piper, watching from the edge of the crowd, held her breath, then nodded. The room erupted into applause, warm and unknowing. Across the floor, Riven's hand curled into a fist tight enough to whiten his knuckles, certain the story he thought had just ended was only a piece she'd placed on purpose. By the time police arrived at Jet's apartment that night, sirens cutting blue and red across a quiet street, he was arrested on money laundering charges, evidence Isolde had quietly helped assemble. What none of the guests understood was that Jet had spent months blackmailed by the Volkov family over his younger brother's criminal record, a threat held over his head so long he'd stopped flinching at it, the way a person stops flinching at pain that never really goes away. A public engagement to a woman visibly under Ashcroft protection changed his risk calculation overnight. Harming him now would look like a direct provocation against the family. That protection was what finally gave him the safety to hand over every threatening message the Volkovs had sent him. Message after message he'd kept for over a year, too afraid to use them, waiting, without knowing it, for someone like Isolde to make using them survivable. Accepting Jet's proposal cost Isolde something she never said out loud. For one evening, she became exactly the kind of person who uses another human being as a tool. The very thing she'd hated most about the family that once used her. She justified it the only way strategists ever do, that Jet walked away, safer for having been used than he would have been left alone with the Volkovs. It's the quiet, uncomfortable proof that surviving a house built on manipulation sometimes means learning to speak its language fluently, even when you hate every word of it. The next morning, in a room gone quiet enough to hear the radiator ticking in the corner, Gideon Ashcroft stood before the full family and told the truth, without his usual diplomacy. He had arranged from the beginning for Isolde to enter Riven's world, a test never explained to either of them, to see whether his son could recognize someone who wouldn't shrink from power. He said it plainly, without apology, the way a man says something he decided long ago he'd never regret. This was the same man who had built an empire out of exactly this kind of patient, devastating precision. A real mafia boss in every sense that mattered, even at his own family's dinner table. From the back of the room, a voice murmured, "That body did all that?" The words landed and hung there, ugly in the sudden quiet. Isolde heard every syllable. She did not lower her head. Instead, she played for the whole family the decoded cipher that had once stopped an assassination attempt on Gideon's life, the same skill the room had just openly doubted a moment earlier. The recording filling the silence with the flat, precise cadence of numbers turning into names, the whispering stopped. No one in that room said another word about her body for the rest of the night. Riven crossed to stand near her, close enough that she could hear the breath he took before he spoke. In Russian, his voice trembling for the first time in his life, he said, "You understood everything from the beginning." She had, and she had carried it without once asking anyone to make it easier. That evening alone on the balcony, the city's noise thinned to almost nothing behind her. She looked down at the dark river. He thinks the truth is finally out, she thought. But there's still one person in this family who hasn't said the whole truth yet. The family gathered again the next day, and the room felt different from every meeting that had come before it. The same mahogany table, the same tall windows fogged gray with morning, but none of the usual formality. Someone had left a chair pulled out and never pushed back in. No one bothered to fix it. Gideon sat at the head of the table, hands folded, watching his son with the stillness of a man who already knew how this would end and had simply been waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up. Celine stood near the window, arms crossed, unable to keep the corner of her mouth from lifting. Even the older men, the same two who had once stood at the foot of a bed speaking Russian over a woman they assumed couldn't understand them, sat lower in their chairs now, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Word had already moved through the family like weather. The Volkov delegation had gone quiet. Money that should have wired itself into 3 accounts by Friday hadn't moved at all. Isolde stood at the center of it, in a plain gray coat, no jewelry but the ring, and let the silence stretch until it belonged to her. "I want you to stand in front of this family," she said, "and say one thing clearly." Riven's hand tightened once on the back of a chair before he let it go. For a moment, his eyes went somewhere else entirely, back to a cramped security room weeks earlier. Coffee steam curling off a cup she hadn't touched 4 minutes, on a clock no one else had believed in. That was the day something in him had first cracked open, though he hadn't had a word for it yet. He had one now. The room waited. A clock somewhere down the hall ticked through the silence, each second landing heavier than the last. Riven's jaw worked once, twice, before he found the words, not the smooth, rehearsed cadence he'd used with Nadia for 3 weeks, but something rougher, closer to the man underneath it. One of the older men shifted, cleared his throat, started to say something about protocol, whether a woman with no blood tie to the family should hold operational paper at all. Gideon didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man until the man stopped talking. Nothing more needed to be said twice in that room anymore. Riven turned to face the people who had watched a recording of him calling her something small. "Isolde Maren was never practice," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room without needing to rise. "Not for a single day. Not the first night, and not any night after it. I said those words because I didn't yet understand what I was looking at. That's on me, not on her." He placed a thick folder into her hands, operational authority over the family's entire clean logistics division, 40 pages of transferred signatures, 3 of them Gideon's own. The paper was heavier than it should have been for something so thin. Then quietly, only for her, his voice dropping below what the rest of the room could hear, "I'm not giving you this to make up for what I did. I'm giving it to you because for 3 months, every major decision I've made has needed a second signature.
the Chesterport extension, the insurance restructuring, the supplier switch, nobody else caught, and that signature has always been yours, even when you didn't know it. I just finally stopped pretending I didn't need it. Somewhere behind them, Gideon allowed himself the smallest exhale, not quite a laugh, not quite relief, but close enough to both that Celine noticed it and filed it away. His fingers, resting on the edge of the table, tapped once against the wood, a small, private gesture, the kind a man makes when he's finally set something down he's carried for years. It would mean nothing to anyone else in that room. Isolde noticed it anyway. She always noticed everything. Isolde set her own folder on the table in return, a contingency plan she had built alone, late at night, over the past month. Emergency contacts, written in her own careful hand, exit routes, marked on maps in pencil rather than pen, every worst-case scenario that could ever befall him, laid out in pages he'd never known existed. Taped inside the back cover was a single, handwritten line. Nothing more. If you're reading this, it means I was right to be careful. She had built a way to save the life of the man who had once discarded her, and had never once mentioned it. Riven turned through the pages slowly, his own routes, his own risks, mapped by someone who'd had every reason to let him walk into any one of them unwarned. And something in him gave way completely. His jaw worked once before he trusted himself to speak again, and he said nothing at all. She accepted the operational keys. She did not hand him the keys to her own penthouse. Before she left the room, Gideon rose from his chair, slower than a man his age should have needed to, and crossed to her with an envelope in hand, plain, unmarked, sealed. His hand lingered on it a half-second longer than the handoff required, the way a man hesitates before letting go of something he's held on to for a very long time. "Not today," he said when she made to open it. "You'll know when." It was the only thing he said to her all morning, and he said it like a promise he intended to keep, whether she asked him to or not. Celine caught her arm gently on the way past. "You could have let it burn down around him," she said low enough for only Isolde to hear. "Everyone would have understood." "I didn't do it for him," Isolde said. "I did it so I'd never have to wonder later if I let something happen that I could have stopped. That's not the same thing as forgiveness." Celine nodded once, like a debt being marked paid. "For what it's worth," she added, quieter still, "I never once believed the recording. Not for a second." It wasn't much. It was, Isolde thought, exactly enough. "They called me the curvy girl who didn't belong at the table," Isolde said, already turning toward the door. "I think I'll keep the table." She stepped into the elevator alone. The brass doors closed on her own reflection before she let her shoulders drop just slightly, just for the 4 floors it took to reach the lobby. In her coat pocket unopened sat the envelope Gideon had pressed into her hands before she left the room, thin and heavier than anything else that had happened that day. Her fingers found its edge once, then let it be. Some things she had learned were only ready to be true when you were ready to hold them. 3 months passed, and the division that had once been just a name on a shell company's letterhead became something real under Isolde's hands. She ran it with the same precision she'd once used to break Russian ciphers in a cold security room, reading every contract twice, trusting no verbal promise that wasn't also in writing. In her second week, too, of the old guard men tried to reroute a shipment around her approval the way they'd always done with every woman who'd ever sat near that desk. She didn't raise her voice. She froze the account, sent one email confirming she'd done it, and waited. By the time they came to her office to argue, she had the original authorization papers already printed and waiting on the desk, Riven's signature and Gideon's both visible at the bottom. "You're welcome to take this up with either of them," she said, sliding the papers across. Neither man ever tried it again.
Word of it moved through the company the way word always moves through companies, quietly over coffee in the 2 minutes before a meeting starts. By the 4th week, no one rerouted anything without her sign-off first. By the 8th one, of the same 2 men brought her a shipping discrepancy before it became a problem instead of after sliding it across her desk with something almost like respect in the gesture. She thanked him and said nothing else, because some victories didn't need to be celebrated out loud to be real. Riven handled the family's darker corners the way he always had, but let none of that shadow reach her, not because she asked him to, but because for the first time in his life, protecting someone didn't feel like ownership. He had grown slowly, and without announcing it, into the kind of man capable of one day standing where his father stood, not just as an heir, but as a Mafia boss, who understood, finally, that real power meant protecting the people who'd earned his trust, not testing them. What changed between them in those 3 months wasn't romance rebuilding itself from nothing. It was something slower and harder to fake. 2 people learning to ask permission from each other in small, unglamorous ways. He started knocking on doors he used to walk through. She started telling him where she'd be, not because he demanded it, but because she wanted to. Trust, rebuilt correctly, rarely announces itself. It just quietly stops needing to be tested. There was an evening midway through the 3rd month when he found her still at her desk long after the building had emptied, the overhead lights dimmed to half, papers fanned out under a single lamp exactly the way she used to work at her kitchen table. He didn't say anything. He pulled up the chair across from her, unbuttoned his cuffs, and started reading the same contract upside down, following her pen with his eyes until she finally looked up. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said, and kept reading anyway. Neither of them mentioned that it was the first time he'd stayed simply because he wanted to be near her working, not because there was something to protect her from. Piper came by once that autumn, dropped a bag of takeout on Isolde's new desk, and looked around the office like she was memorizing it. "You built all this in 3 months?" she said. "You used to translate other people's contracts for a living. Now you write them." Isolde didn't answer right away. She just smiled the way she used to before any of this happened. And for a moment Piper saw the friend she remembered, not just the woman the whole family had learned to be careful around. One rainy night identical to the first, the same sideways October rain, the same gold smear of city lights through wet glass. Riven stood outside her door, soaked through to the collar, water running off the tattoo at his throat in a thin, dark line. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't sent anyone to walk in front of him this time either. The hallway light overhead flickered once, buzzing faintly, and for a moment neither of them moved, him dripping quietly onto the mat, her hand still resting on the half-open door. The sound of rain against the stairwell window behind him, the only thing filling the silence. "Am I allowed to start over?" he asked, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice had nothing performed in it at all. "Not as practice, as someone real." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he almost turned to leave, certain he'd asked for something she wasn't going to give him twice. 3 months ago, you would have sent someone to check the hallway before you knocked, she said quietly. 3 months ago, I didn't know what I'd be losing if I got it wrong again, he said. She reached up, wiped the rain from the tattoo at his throat with her thumb, slow and unhurried, and answered him in Russian, in the same language he'd once used to call her disposable, believing she couldn't hear him at all. "Only if you remember that this time I'm the one teaching." He almost smiled. It was the first time in months either of them had let a moment be that simple. They sat together on the sofa afterward. A fire low in the grate, the river visible through rain-streaked windows. And for a while, neither of them said anything at all. The kind of silence that used to feel like danger between them, and now just felt like rest.
His hand found the edge of the blanket over her knees, not reaching for her exactly, just close enough that she could close the distance herself if she wanted to. She did. Her hand brushed against her coat pocket, and she remembered all at once the envelope, still waiting there unopened since the day Gideon had pressed it into her hands before she left the room. She finally reached for it. Her fingers hesitated over the seal for a moment, an old habit, the same patience that had kept her from opening the warehouse safe the first night she found it, before she finally broke it open. The paper inside was old enough to have yellowed slightly at the folds, the ink a shade lighter than anything printed in the last 5 years. Inside was a transfer agreement, 51% ownership of the entire Clean Logistics division, signed 5 years earlier, the exact day she'd found Gideon Ashcroft collapsed in a hotel corridor with a coded ledger clutched in his hand and his own men too slow to help him. She remembered the fluorescent hum of that hallway, the way his fingers had gripped the ledger, even half-conscious, like some part of him understood even then that the numbers inside it mattered more than his own pulse. She had knelt on the carpet in a borrowed coat and stayed until the ambulance came, asking for nothing, expecting even less. He must have signed this agreement that same night, still shaking, before the ink on his own gratitude had even dried, and simply waited for 5 years, through every gala and every dismissal and every night she spent underestimated at his son's side for the day it would matter. He had prepared it from the very beginning. If his son ever again treated her as disposable, she would have enough power to walk away and never be looked down on by anyone again. Her hands didn't shake, but she read the signature line twice anyway, as if the date might change the second time. 5 years. He had carried this in a drawer somewhere for 5 years through every family dinner where no one had thought to ask her opinion and never once let it slip. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. An encrypted message, 3 lines, nothing more. Volkov has withdrawn. They're afraid of the woman holding 51%. Riven looked at the document, then at her understanding fully for the first time that the woman once called bed practice had held the power to decide his family's fate all along and had never once used it to hurt him. His hand found hers on the cushion between them, not gripping, just resting there, the way you touch something to make sure it's still real. She set the contract down on the low table between them. "Now you choose," she said, her voice steady, the same steadiness she'd used the night she said nothing at all and walked out of a room instead of screaming in it. "Keep this with me or let me walk away with it." "I don't want you to walk away with it," he said. "I want you to stay and hold it with me. Not because the family needs you, because I need you. The way I should have needed you from the first night, instead of the way I actually treated you." "Then we hold it together," she said. "But you remember this Riven Ashcroft. I will never again be someone you get to underestimate." "I know," he said. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I don't forget it." Outside, the rain kept falling over the same river that had witnessed everything the night she found Gideon in a hallway with a ledger in his hand, the night she heard 4 seconds of Russian she was never supposed to understand, the night a ring turned out to be a key. But the room no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the quiet start of something built on truth instead of assumption. In the end, this story is about what happens when the world prices your worth by your dress size instead of what you're carrying inside you, and about the exact moment you decide to stop paying that price. If you're reading this in a house that's quieter than it used to be, here's something practical, not poetic. Keep one chair, one drawer, one small routine that's entirely yours, something no one gets to rearrange or explain away on your behalf. Isolde kept her penthouse key even after she got everything else. You can keep your Sunday phone call with your sister, your own name on, your own bank account, your own opinion at the family table, even when someone insists they're just simplifying things for you. If people start talking past you instead of to you at the pharmacy counter at a family dinner, write down exactly what was said that same evening in your own handwriting. not to relive it, so that later you remember you heard it correctly the first time. If Isolde's transformation moved you tonight, tell us in the comments what it meant to you. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded their worth was never up for debate. And if you believe in stories where quiet strength finally gets the recognition it deserves, like this video and subscribe. There are so many more women like Isolde whose stories are still waiting to be told.